One thing most parents and students find different about attending South Warren Middle School is that in the math department, we use standards-based grading. And standards-based grading really reminds me of the report cards that my second and third grader bring home. If you look at this sheet, this is the type of test analysis sheet that your students will receive the day after a test has been taken and graded. So really what they do is look at that test, and instead of looking at the percentage and looking holistically at how they did overall, they take this analysis sheet and really begin to dissect the test and look at it skill by skill, standard by standard. So if you look, here are all the different test questions on one of my tests, one of my assessments from last year over congruent and similar transformations. And they have to go through and mark for every single question. Did they get the question right? If so, great, move on. Did they get it wrong? If they get it wrong, they have to do a little bit more digging, a little bit more thinking. Was it a simple mistake? They just, misadded or missubtracted, something small. Or did they really not know what they were doing? And that they may need to come back and look at that again. What is also informational is this a standard that is being assessed. So if you look, the first grouping, all of questions 1 through 6, really ask students to apply the first standard or the first skill in which they were being assessed. So something that they were taught and they're being tested on. Then, of course, there was a second skill that was being assessed, a fifth, a third, a fourth. And so they can look over here in this left-hand column and really see all the different skills that tie directly to each of the test questions. So they go on down and they use this form for all of their test questions. This test had 35 questions. Then we get to the table that really lets them know, okay, so now you know overall, how you did right and wrong, but what does that mean? Well, in this particular assessment, there were 7 skills or 7 standards that were being tested. So, for example, now that we're down into the analysis table, if, let's say on standard 4, you have 4 possible questions that you could have answered correctly, number 10, 14, 16, and 18. And if you would like to know what ICAN 4, standard 4 is, what is it you're being assessed on, it's right down here. Describe the effects of rotations on a two-dimensional figure using coordinates. So these 4 questions assessed how well you could do that. Find the effect using coordinates. So let's say that you answered 3 of these correct. Then when you looked back at these 3 test questions, got it right, got it wrong, you got 3. Well, if you look over here, that tells you then how well you did. You really only missed 1 out of 4 questions. That's pretty good. You get to say that you were mastery, which we record in the grade book as a 3. So for this particular skill in my grade book, I would record a 3, mastery. So all 7 of these ICANs, the actual standard itself down here will go into the grade book, and instead of seeing that your student maybe made an 80% on the whole test and you're not really sure what they missed and what they're good at, and they don't even know what they missed and what they're good at, then what you'll see instead are all 7 or however many there are standards that were really being tested, and you will see individually what did they master, what did they partially master, and what are they still limited in their understanding on, and we need to go back and reteach, because that's the beauty of this. Your students are retaught. They do have the opportunity to retest, which I'll explain in a later video, but instead of having to take the entire assessment again, they really only need to retake the parts where they showed less than mastery, and this lets you see that. So here's another example of a test analysis sheet from one of my geometry courses. Again, it is the same setup as far as you can see the ICAN number, the standard. There are places for students to mark got it right, got it wrong. If you miss it, then there is a review of simple mistake or do you need help. This will come back into play also with the test retakes, is further deeper analysis of why mistakes were made, either simple or needing to figure out what was going on. As we scroll down, again on this assessment there were, strangely enough, 7 learning targets, 7 standards that were assessed, and you can see again the questions that directly align to each of these 7 standards and how many questions you had to answer correctly to show mastery. partial mastery, or limited mastery. Now, this is a nice view and understanding of the student's abilities. Exactly what is it that they do very, very well? What is it that they still need to learn? So when we go back to reteach and retest, we can be very direct with the reteaching and the relearning process and not teach things that they already know. But many parents and students wonder, okay, well, now you have 7 different levels. Mastery is level 3, partial mastery is 2, limited mastery, which really means we need to work on this quite a bit, is a 1. And you see these standards very directly that describe your students' abilities. But what does that mean? What does that mean for a grade? Because ultimately we do have to give you a grade out of 100 points by the end of the quarter. So each test will contain a little chart. And this chart says in progress grade. Understanding your grade so far. Because in the grade book there will be 7 separate scores of a 1, 2, or 3 for each of the learning targets. So there will never be a percentage grade. And once 2 or 3 assessments are given, then you will have more than 7 learning targets, more than 7 mastery levels, and I always look at these as a whole group at the end of the quarter. I do not group these learning targets by test and look at individual tests. I always look at the masteries as a whole group, however many there happen to be by the end of the quarter. So that's why this is a so far. If this were the first test, then you would have 7 grades. If you were perfect, you mastered everything, each of those 7 would be a 3, which means if you were to add their value together, you would have a total value, a total point value of 21 if each of your 7 scores were a 3. If you perfectly mastered all 7 learning targets, then you would have a 100 in my class. You are definitely where you need to be. You're mastering everything. You're doing great. But very few people show perfect mastery. So if I've gone back in on my other assessment here, and I have put in just some samples of what a student could get. A student could show partial mastery of the first I can, full mastery of the second, very limited mastery on the third skill standard, and then mastery again on the fourth, partial mastery on the fifth. You know, students tend to show varying levels of mastery, which means it would be hard to say they are completely mastery, completely partial, or completely limited because they have scores that range across all 3 categories. So for the sake of transitioning these into a grade out of 100, what we do is add them up. We bring the sum total together. So 2 plus 3 is 5, plus 1 is 6, plus 3 is 9, plus 2 is 11, plus 3 is 14, plus 1 more is 15. They would have a total of 15 mastery points. Well, if we come back to this assessment analysis, you can look, all right, so if your point total were 15, which means there were some standards you just did not master, then if I were to put a grade in the grade book for you, you would be sitting right at a 78. So if this were the end of the quarter for you, you would have a 78, a C, for that quarter. Now, this is where, again, we also talk about reteaching, and I have a whole video dedicated to what it takes to be able to be retaught and retested, because honestly, you know, math is a building subject. I don't want to leave students with limited mastery here and here. I want them to go back and learn, and when they relearn and retest, they would only retest that particular learning target. It would be different questions, but it would be that particular learning target, and then the most recent grade, the most recent indicator of what that student knows would be the final indicator in the grade book. So these point totals could change if students go back, retest, improve those scores, and improve their overall point total. Now, of course, this will all be tracked in their data notebook, so they and you can kind of have an idea of where they stand, as well as I know where they stand. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, but this is one of the most confusing parts of standards-based grading, is that eventually at the end of the quarter, not during the quarter. These are converted back into a grade out of 100 because that's the reporting style for middle school students, and especially if your student is in algebra getting high school credit. So I wanted you to sort of see how this works. These are only posted in the gradebook formally at midterm and end of quarter, which is why these in-progress understanding sheets will be made available on Edmodo and my website, so you and your student can at least keep track of where they stand out of 100, because I know that's an important thing to you. But I like the more descriptive standards-based grading where you can not only look at them and say, well, my child is a 78. What does that mean about them as an individual? You can look at these standards and look at their mastery levels and know exactly what that means about your child as an individual and what they are good at.